Jesus celebrated the Passover feast with the disciples and instituted the Lord's Supper. After that, Jesus spent several hours in the Garden of Gethsemane, struggling with the Lord's will. From there, Jesus was arrested by the temple police, probably about 2 a.m. or so, and marched to the high priest's house, where the religious leaders condemned him in a hastily assembled and completely rigged trial. They condemned him to death. But indeed, there's the rub. Because Israel is an occupied territory. They no longer self-govern themselves, at least completely, and so they do not have the ability to condemn anyone to capital punishments. Thus, they needed to convince the Romans to kill this troublemaker named Jesus. This is where our story picks up. I'll be reading from Mark 15, 1 through 15. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things, and Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the festival, Pilate used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. And so the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his normal custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. And Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you want me to do with the man that you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them. And after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Pontius Pilate hated Jews, and he didn't much care for Jerusalem. You could hardly blame him. Being the governor of Judea was a bit like being the American ambassador to Afghanistan or Iraq. You surrounded yourself with top-notch troops, you lived behind thick walls in the green zone, and you never went out in public unless you were armed to the teeth. It was a hard job in an admittedly unpleasant place. That's why Pilate's normal home was not in Jerusalem, but rather along the coast, where he had a beautiful sea breeze day and night. He only came to Jerusalem when it was only necessary to keep the peace, to keep these troublesome Jews in their place. The annual festival of Passover was one such time when he needed to be in Jerusalem. Recall that Passover was the Jewish equivalent of the American Independence Day, the 4th of July, and that the population of the city would swell from approximately 25,000 people to about frustrated Jews, eager for someone, some Messiah, to come and to save them from these damnable Romans. Pilate's job was to keep these angry Jews in line and to keep the tax money flowing from wealthy Palestine back to Rome. Historians tell us that Pilate didn't care for his job, but that he was good at it. Perhaps too good at his job. The name Pilate itself means armed with a javelin, and he lived up to that title. In fact, just 4 years after Jesus' death, Pilate will crucify 2,000 Jewish rebels along the road between Jerusalem and Damascus. Can you imagine that? 2,000 Jewish rebels at one time along the main road into the holy city. Such brutality was a shock even to the Roman Senate, and Pilate was later reassigned to a less stressful position shortly thereafter. So here's the question of the day. Why is it that this cruel, ruthless man is so conflicted about Jesus? He already would go on to sentence thousands of these so-called messiahs to death. I mean, what was the big problem with one more? Well, there must have been something different about this Messiah. Something in his eyes that told Pilate that this man, Jesus, already bloodied and bruised by the temple police, that this Jesus, this Messiah, was innocent. Certainly no threat to the Roman Empire. Mark tells us that Pilate tried to release Jesus and even told the crowd that he thought that he was innocent. If we would read the Gospel of John, we will see 5 or 6 different ways there in that Gospel account of how Pilate tried to get Jesus free. And yet, as Adam Hamilton says, after all of his resistance to the idea of crucifying Jesus, we come to one of the saddest lines in all of the passion, of Jesus' passion. It is this: so Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them. Wishing to satisfy the crowd. Pilate knew that this was wrong. He had the power to stop it, and yet he caved in to the pressure of the crowd. Maybe he felt that his job was at risk. Maybe he feared a riot if he didn't release Jesus. Maybe he was just having a bad day and was tired. But for whatever reasons, Jesus, or Pilate, gave in to the crowd. Do you see any of yourself in Pontius Pilate? And who is your crowd? Your coworkers, perhaps? Maybe those just 1 notch ahead of you on the social scale. Maybe it's your friends. Who is it that you wish to satisfy? So much so that you are willing to do even what you know is the wrong thing to do. The whole Christian life, friends, is a call to go against the crowd. A call, as Paul says in his letter to the Romans, a call not to be conformed to this world, but rather to be transformed by the renewal of your minds. And that's a hard thing, isn't it? I think about all of the incredibly stupid things that I did as a teenager to please my crowd. I partied way too much. And there were nights when I drove home drunk. And friends, I want to tell you, I'm lucky I didn't kill somebody as a teenager. I could have been Clint Brewer, who I talked about a little while ago, the guy who killed a 12-year-old in my previous congregation. Stupid things just to be accepted by other people. And of course, it doesn't stop when we become adults, does it? I don't know about you, but I still feel the pressure. Pressure to drive the right kind of a car, not to let our car get too old. Pressure to live in the right neighborhood. Pressure to wear the right clothes that are fashionable. Pressure to have the right attractive body. Pressure to have the right cell phone. And all of that is just as stupid as me driving home drunk at night. Because we, friends, are called to follow Jesus, not the crowd. That's one of the reasons that being regular in worship attendance is so important. Because for 1 hour of the week, we gather together and we remind ourselves of what is truly significant in life. We remind ourselves of what really lasts and means something in life. And we encourage one another to live by God's standards, not by the world's standards. And I can't speak for you, but I know that I need that. I see too much of myself in Pilate. And I see too much of myself in the crowd in this story also. The crowd that chose Jesus Barabbas, as Matthew's Gospel will tell us his full name is, to choose that Jesus over Jesus of Nazareth. The crowd that chose to rebel, the crowd that chose the rebel who had committed murder over the rabbi who had committed no evil whatsoever, who chose the man of force over the man of peace. Now, history, of course, is full of crowds who made the exact same choice. When push comes to shove, most nations are way too quick to choose the way of violence and force over peaceful diplomacy. And I am not convinced whatsoever that we are any better as individuals than we are as a nation. How many times, for instance, do we come into conflictual situations in our families, in our workplaces, in schools, even in our churches with our guns ablazing and itching for a fight? And we just plow over others, sometimes even those that we love, without hearing their side of it or even attempting a peaceful resolution of the problem. I know that I have been guilty of that. At the end of the day, all of us are like that crowd that chooses the way of force over the way of peace. And we're like Pilate, who chooses to please the crowd instead of God. And yet, thanks be to God, there's one other person in this Bible passage that we're supposed to identify with today, and that is Barabbas. Barabbas is like the crowd and Pilate all together. He's chosen to please the crowd by choosing the way of violence. He's rejected God and sought to save himself and his people by whatever means are necessary. Barabbas deserved to die that Friday, and yet Jesus died in his place, and Barabbas went free. All of us, dear friends, all of us are like Barabbas. We are sinners deserving to be punished for our rebellion against God and the way we hurt those around us. And yet God, in God's mercy, sent Christ to be the atoning sacrifice for our sins. Jesus has died that we may be set free. Isaiah foresaw it long ago when he envisioned this figure called the suffering servant. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, Isaiah says. And yet we have accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. He was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole. And by his bruises we are healed. And this brings us to our bird cage, which I'm sure you've been wondering about today. Well, you see, there once was a pastor by the name of George Thomas who came to his small New England church one day with a bird cage, not that unlike this older bird cage here. Thank you to Dora and Bill Brubaker for loaning us this cage. And this pastor said it by his pulpit, like I've said it this one here. Just like you, a few eyebrows were raised, and so the pastor began to speak. He said, I was walking through town yesterday when I saw a young boy coming towards me swinging this bird cage, which with 3 little frightened and scared and cold field birds inside of it. I stopped the boy and I asked him what he had. Just some old birds, came the reply. What are you going to do with them? I asked. Oh, I don't know. I'm going to take them home and I'm going to have me some fun with them. I'm going to tease them, and I'm going to pull out their feathers, and I'm going to teach those birds to fight one another. I'm going to have me a real good time. But you'll get tired of those birds sooner or later, said the pastor. What will you do then? Oh, I got some cats too. They like birds, those cats do. I'll give the birds to the cats. The pastor said that he thought for a moment, and then he asked the boy how much he wanted for the birds. Huh? Why, you don't want them birds, mister. They're just plain old field birds. I mean, they don't sing and they ain't pretty either. How much? The pastor asked. The boy sized the pastor up and thought he was 3 shades north of insane. He said, $10. Done, said the pastor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet and handed the young child a $10 bill. The boy was gone in a flash. The pastor then said he picked up the cage and he walked down an alley and he found a green park there with a tree and flowers, and he opened up the door to the cage and he let the birds free. Well, that explained the empty bird cage, the congregation thought. But the pastor continued on. One day, he said, Satan and Jesus were having a conversation. Satan had just come from the Garden of Eden, and he was boasting and gloating about what he'd done. Yes, sir, said the devil. I just caught me a world full of people down there, set me a trap. I used bait that I knew they couldn't resist. Got every last one of them human beings. What are you going to do with them? Jesus asked. Oh, the devil replied, and I'm going to have me some fun. I'm going to teach them how to marry and divorce. I'm going to teach them how to hate one another and how to abuse one another, how to drink and smoke and curse. And then I'm going to teach them how to invent bombs and guns and how to kill one another. I'm going to have me some fun. What do you do with them when you're done with them? Jesus asked. I'll just kill them. Or better yet, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to fill their heads so full of lies that they're going to kill themselves. How much do you want for them? Jesus asked. The devil said, you don't want those people. They ain't no good. They're bad people. Why, you take them and they're just going to hate you. They'll spit on you. They'll curse at you. And in the end, they're going to kill you. looked at Jesus like he was 3 shades north of insane. And he said, all your blood, every last sinew of your body, and your dying breath. And Jesus said, done. And he paid the price. Thanks be to God. As the choir gathers, I would invite you to prepare your hearts to receive this costly sacrifice, this gift of grace, of deep, deep love.